thank you, Ralph, for this wonderful introduction. I'm just sad you're taking the dog away. Can we accommodate him here or something? And I'll do this in English because I think Jaroslaw prefers English. Perhaps there's some other people in English as well, but obviously I speak German, and if people have questions in German, or we can do some of the Q&A in German. And I think the idea was just for me to speak extemporaneously for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll be in conversation and obviously have some time to exchange ideas with all of you as well. I've been thinking a little bit about the fact that I went to university in the year 2000 when I was 18 years old. So it's been a little over 25 years. Though I was quite robustly left-wing when I was 18 years old, there was a kind of worldview which was very mainstream and which ranged from the relative outer edges of the left to the relative outer edges of the right, which socialized me politically, which set my ideas and horizons about the world at that historical juncture. And they included some basic ideas like the notion that nationalism had been the ideology of the 20th century, and that in the 21st century it really wouldn't be dominating how the world works, that we would come to see a greater and greater influence of supranational institutions like the European Union, international organizations like the United Nations, that international law would order the world. The assumption that globalization and the growth of economic trade would liberalize countries around the world, that China might become a democracy, and even if it didn't, that it would certainly be much more free and freewheeling than it had been in the past. Assumptions about social mobility, that we would send everybody to university, and once everybody's gone to university, they'd all go and become computer programmers who can code and make a lot of money, and that's how we're going to create a more affluent economy. The idea that the only people who think that immigration could bring significant problems to societies are the kind of ewig gestrigen, those who are still stuck in the past and really haven't understood the sign of the times. And as I survey those basic components of the worldview that I would have had in the year 2000, that I think a lot of us had in the year 2000, to which I think many of us still in key ways feel a real loyalty, it just strikes me that it has fallen apart at its seams to a remarkable degree. In fact, it seems to me that it's very hard to think of a 25-year period in recent history in which a worldview has fallen apart to a similar extent, other than at the influence of outside forces of giant proportions like World War I or World War II. Probably from 1910 to 1950, the kind of assumptions you would have had in 1910 were completely pulverized by 1950. But it took 2 world wars to do that. For all of the serious crises of the last 25 years, it strikes me that we haven't lived anything on the order of World War I or World War II, and yet all of those comfortable assumptions about the world that we had seem to have disappeared. And I think that this poses a deep political problem, because those of us who are still nostalgic for this worldview of the year 2000, I think have this instinctive sense that we represent the future, that we are the ones who have actually understood the world, and we are speaking to this present moment. And it's these weird populists who are running around who are the ones who are stuck in a weird past. And that both gives us the self-understanding that we just have to stay the course and persevere, and that's how we're going to vanquish them. They'll die off eventually. And I think the kind of arrogance to say, we know how things work and what the actual answers are. And even though I don't think that the answer lies either with Donald Trump or the AfD and the right-wing populists, or for that matter with the people on the left who reject liberalism for a new form of identity politics, I think to a lot of ordinary people out there, they actually look at people who are still in the world of ideas of the year 2000, and they say, you guys are stuck in the past. You guys don't understand the science of the times. And these other people who we might not like in every respect, who we might have certain issues with, who we might think can't govern and do bad things and so on, but at least they're speaking like it's the year 2026. They've actually understood something about this moment. And I think that moderate political forces are not going to be able to get out of the very, very deep slump they're in at the moment. I don't have to go through the details of this. You're a highly knowledgeable audience. You know that even though Democrats hopefully will win the midterms in 2026, they are more unpopular at the moment in polls than they have ever been. Trump is also very unpopular, so they might win. But if you just ask people the opinion of the Democratic Party, they are at the historic lows of popularity. I don't have to remind you about die Umfragewerte der AfD or about the fact that Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella are favored to win the next French national election, about the fact that Nigel Farage looks like he's going to win in England. I don't think that's going to change until we have a kind of bonfire of certainties. Throw some of those assumptions from the year 2000 on a cleansing fire. Hold on to the values that undergirded it in many ways and reimagine where we're at, how we can actually fight for those values in a new world. So that's one point I want to make. The other point that I want to make, which is kind of making the same point but in a broader historical lens, is that I think liberalism has undergone periodic historical crises when we reached junctures in which a liberalism built in one world with one set of circumstances ceased being able to speak to a changed world with changed historical circumstances. I think that was true with the rise of industrial capitalism in the mid-19th century. Liberalism did not at first have the answers to how to govern factories in Manchester and so on. And it took a real reinvention of what the liberal tradition would mean in order for liberalism to fight its way back. And it was true, obviously, in the middle of the 20th century, when an older form of liberalism didn't have the internal tools and resources to confront totalitarianism in its fascist and communist forms. I think we're now in the third big crisis of liberalism. And I think that it will take a reinvention of a liberal tradition, which is as fundamental and as imaginative as the one that we accomplished in the 19th century and the 20th century, for liberalism to fight its way back towards being the lingua franca of our politics, the kind of operating system of our politics. And the thing that worries me more than the very concerning antics that Donald Trump is up to every day and that Nigel Farage might get up to, Marine Le Pen might get up to, and the AfD might get up to if they get the chance, is that not enough serious intellectual work is happening on making that reinvention happen. And so I very much admire Ralph and the work that you do here and some of the people in the room who I recognize, because I think that this is the place in Germany where this work is trying to be done. But I think we need to be self-critical on this point. We're not there. And I think until we get there, we might avert the worst in this or that election, but we're not going to get out of this political era.
Thank you for that introduction that virtually takes us straight to the point. This is one of the series of our debates on how to react to the populism on one hand, on the wokeism on the other hand. So we are trying to cope and to rethink liberalism. It's one of the titles of our books in the CLM here. But it's also the question of what, in your opinion, is so right among all those criticisms of liberalism, from the left to the right. If you are really forced to choose one or maybe two main lines of criticism that should be refought profoundly by us.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will pick one that is sort of a left-wing one, or at least I think is a smarter version of a left-wing critique, and one that is, I think, quite firmly a right-wing one. So on the left, I think there's a class critique to be made of our society that is very serious and significant. And it is importantly different from some of the class critiques that are made most comfortably and most loudly by the center-left. Mm-hmm. We're talking earlier about the Green Party, and the most striking thing about the Green Party is that, correct me if I'm wrong about this, its voters now are the richest voting base in Germany, right? Kamala Harris in 2024, there was a great chart about this in The Economist. If you plot the socioeconomic status of all of the voters for the last 18 US presidential candidates on the Democratic side and the Republican side, whose coalition did that of Kamala Harris most resemble of the last 18 candidates, winning and losing? It wasn't Joe Biden in 2020, it wasn't Barack Obama in 2012, it was Bob Dole, the Republican candidate in 1996. The best predictor of whether you voted for Kamala Harris was whether you were highly educated and affluent, right? And I think there's a much deeper and broader problem with the absolute dominance of society by a professional managerial class, right? The people who have got good university degrees, the people who live in the nice neighborhoods of Berlin, right? The people who speak foreign languages, the people in this room, right, including you and me, right? Part of the problem is that we haven't governed society terribly well. But if you look at that 25-year period, there was 9/11, the wrong response to it, and there was the 2008 financial crisis, and there was an overconfidence about immigration, and there was COVID, and the complicated response to it. So people have reason to look at this professional managerial class and say you're not living up to your promises. But part of it is just that they feel that this is a very smug, very self-confident set of people who believe that they deserve to be there to rule, because they are often a meritocratic class, they are often competent, they are often the people who did well at university and so on, right? They're not a hereditary aristocracy. They think they know all the answers, have all the truths, and they look down on the rest of the population. This is worse in the United States than in Germany. I think the kind of social distance between the people I'm talking about in America is much more extreme than in Germany for a number of reasons that are worth thinking through in the German context, because it's worth trying to avoid Americanizing what Germany is like in that respect. The regional nature of Germany has something to do with that, the absence of campus universities. There's a number of reasons that I think holds that a little bit in check, but it's true here as well as in the United States. And so I think not the 1%, but Occupy Wall Street wanted to say, we have a 99%. No. The problem is it's not the 1%, it's the 25%. And that, I think, is a criticism of how liberalism is actually working that we should take seriously. And then on the other hand, I think there is a criticism where there's two variants of liberalism. There's a political liberalism and a perfectionist liberalism. There's the liberalism of John Rawls and the liberalism of Joseph Raz. And what we claim is that we have a political liberalism. Right, but liberalism is a set of basic principles that give each of us the freedom to have our own ideas about what's worthwhile in life and to pursue what is most important to us. And we can choose with that to choose lives of creative self-expression and self-discovery and rootlessness and all of these kinds of things. Or we can choose lives that are deeply regionally rooted or deeply religious or any number of other things. And all we want is nobody gets to impose on others how to live, and this is the political liberalism that we stick to. That's the official story. Right? The political liberalism of John Rawls is in philosophy departments and even in ministries more influential than the perfectionist liberalism of Joseph Raz. But it's not always the reality of things. A lot of the time, I think, we do actually favor the people who live a certain kind of life. And we look down on and perhaps even exclude people who live a very different kind of life. And that, again, I think is hard for the people in this room to recognize, because I certainly have the values both of political and of perfectionist liberalism, right? I grew up in Germany and now live in the United States, but spend part of my time in Paris and have a complicated origin and I'm not religious, right? Like, I fit all of that perfectly well, right? A society that valorizes that is very comfortable for me. But I think if we claim, and this is a critique that all of the post-liberal writers, some of whom are more subtle than others, a lot of them are not very subtle, keep making, if we claim it's just all neutral, but actually we keep favoring the people who are like us and the people who also, in the majority, happen to be part of a professional managerial class, so these two things are overlapping a little bit, then that makes a lot of people feel verarscht and excluded.
Okay. But it's, if we take that from even broader perspective, it would mean that the problem is that there are too many educated people, in a way. That was one of the dreams of liberal democracy, post-war liberal democracy, that you should educate, especially at the universities, as many people as possible. That was like an assumption that was now verified, and that would be my question, that in fact, that may, paradoxically, it may mean that what you have said, that from time to time you need a kind of populist correction to the system, because for some obvious reasons, if you are just going on this social elevator, you differentiate yourself in some ways that are surprising to yourself sometimes, yes. But it's not only about the languages, because again, for instance, there are superbly well educated people that are going from Poland to do some, and other Eastern European countries, to do some basic jobs, and sometimes they know 3-4 languages.
Right.
And they earn more than professors at the universities. So where would you put this populist correction? Because our society changes.
Yeah. So look, I think part of that is that we've been too reliant on a certain kind of educational ladder for solving society's problems, right? I mean, go back to 2000, there really was this idea that if 50% of the population go to university, 50% of the population are going to have the kinds of jobs that the 20% of the people who are currently going to university will have. And that obviously isn't the case, right? Even though it's absolutely a good thing to get more educational opportunities for more people and more higher education for more people, it doesn't turn out to be the case that the sort of extra 30% of people you send to university end up with the same views, values, or for that matter, salaries as the first 20%, right? Sure. And so I think there was a naivety about what it would do to encourage everybody to go to college. But and Germany is better on that than some other countries because we have a relatively high, the tertiary degrees, in the trades that, and so on that don't exist in the same way in other places. But I think the problem is not that we have too many educated people. The problem is that the people who are part of the educated class get too many privileges and are too smug.
Do they?
I think they do. And I'll give you one very stupid example, but I think it's very telling. A couple of years ago, I did my PhD in Boston, and so they always talk about this TV show called Cheers, which was a huge show in the 1980s, and it was kind of before my time. And any like city tour you go on, but like here's the Cheers pub, and I'd never seen it and didn't interest me. But a couple of years ago, it came on Netflix, and I was like, okay, let me watch a couple of episodes of this show to like understand this cultural reference point, but I've never, And I watched the show. It's quite good. It's quite funny. It's a sitcom from the 1980s. Something struck me about it compared to the television of recent years, compared to a sitcom like New Girl, for example, or something like that. Two things struck me. The first is that in Cheers, everybody's white. There's a couple of walk-on characters who are not white, but basically it's a completely white world in a city that even in the 1980s was pretty diverse, right? So there's a complete lack of representation of ethnic minorities, which is a blind spot, a shortcoming of this show, right? The other thing is that there's a huge range of social classes depicted in this show, right? Like the lead character is a former sports guy who was on the Boston baseball team and was able to buy the bar that way, but he's really a working class guy. The second lead character is the kind of like annoying English literature grad student who dropped out of university and is now waitressing. And then there's a postman and an accountant and an unemployed guy. And it's sort of like up and down the social ladder, right? When you look at any sitcom today in the United States, it's going to very carefully have picked, a member of every ethnic group in the United States, right? But they all have gone to college. And even if the show claims that one of them hasn't gone to college, they speak exactly like somebody who's gone to a good college. Oh, wow. I'm bringing down the house, I guess.
It was a social ladder.
And so that, that's a better joke. And so, we've increased representation in one way, which is a very good thing, but we've completely forgotten about a different kind of representation, right? If you are not part of that part of society, you are not represented in the media today. And that, I think, is just an interesting, weird cultural blind spot. It's not so significant in itself, but it's very telling about a deeper set of facts about society. Now, you talk about the guy who actually works, earns quite a lot of money, but is not from the educated elite. I don't know how to change this, but I think this is part of the problem. And by the way, if you look at who votes for populists, and that's true in most countries, precisely the person who actually earns quite good money but has relatively low educational status is particularly likely to vote for right-wing populists. And part of that is the feeling of a lack of respect that they get, right? And I will tell you that if the plumber who actually makes very good money and the docent who makes very poor money are at the same dinner party, there's something about the fact of how a society works where the docent is proud to say what the job is, and the plumber, perhaps, depending on who the other people in the room are, feels a little bit like the odd one out. That doesn't need to be the case. I don't know how to change it. It's not like we can pass a law that's going to change it. But that, I think, is a really salient fact about our moment, which we have to take more seriously. And I think I understand the anger of people who are saying, I'm building something in the society and I actually work pretty hard and I'm pretty entrepreneurial and I make good money and all of that is fine. And then you guys look down on me. And why is that?
We don't want to have the black picture of reality today. So my question will be, okay, you went through and there are some pieces of advice in your book, but you are still working on, so this is a work in progress in many ways. If you would like to go and share with us, okay, so where should we start our rethinking liberalism work? Because it's much easier to blame ourselves for this and that, but okay, so let's start working today, and then to continue our work tomorrow morning. Where we should start after the whole endeavor you have made and achieved.
Yeah, I mean, and this last book of mine, which is here in English but also exists in German, Das Zeitalter der Identität, is sort of on a sub-question of that, right? It's an important one, which is the rise of identity politics and how we should respond to that, and I'm very happy to speak to that as well. It's sort of related to what we've been talking about, but it's not exactly the subject of what we've been talking about. I guess I will say that I have a relatively confident set of answers in the short term, and no confident answers in the mid or long term. And I think we need to kind of let those coexist, which is to say that, if you ask me, how can the Democrats win in 2028? Really easy, if they don't do stupid shit. Of course, they will do stupid shit, but it is actually quite easy, which is that there is, I think, a clear middle of a society in America that persists, that you see in every focus group, that you see in opinion polls. And it's been betrayed by both Democrats and Republicans for the last 10 years.
Betrayed?
In the sense that because of a number of structural features of the American political system, including primaries and gerrymandering and so on, the incentives are always to play to the base. And we saw that with Joe Biden, who's a moderate and has moderate instincts, but governed in many ways as a radical. And you see that with Donald Trump, who won the nomination in 2016 because he was seen as more moderate than the other Republicans on some economic issues and so on, but who's ruling as an extremist, right? On every topic you can ask me about, Americans actually have pretty reasonable middle of the ground opinions. On immigration, immigration is a good country, is a good thing for America. We need qualified immigrants. We also need control of the southern border, and we don't like ICE running around arresting people randomly who've been in the country for 30 years. Right? Pretty reasonable set of opinions. The economy. We want economic growth. The free market is the engine of prosperity in our country, and we also want to complete the welfare state. It's ridiculous that you still don't have maternal leave and policies like that, and we should have a robust minimum wage. Majorities of Americans think all of that. Even on a topic like abortion, right? I mean, you can find polls which make it complicated, but when you actually go by trimester, they come up roughly with the policies that have been the basis for an uneasy social compromise on a very complicated subject in Europe as well, which is it should be accessible and free in the first trimester, and after that there should be significant restrictions with exceptions, in particular case of hardship and so on. Right? The problem is that it's incredibly hard to get a politician to actually speak for these positions, because the process by which they're selected, the world with which they're surrounded, the consultants and the staffers and the interns are all, in different ways in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, much, much more ideological than that. So how do Democrats win in 2028? By taking common sense positions on those things and by calling out the extreme things that Donald Trump is doing, and by using, by letting the ripe fruit of his extremism fall into their lap, the desire people are going to have for something else. It's not that hard. What I think is going to be very hard is for him to win in 2032. Because like Keir Starmer in Britain, they're going to come in the best case like Keir Starmer in Britain, who is a moderate without division and without charisma. And the worst case, they're going to come in and it's just the pendulum swinging back, and they're going to be way outside the cultural mainstream the way that Trump is way outside the cultural mainstream. And then we get a president, Donald Trump Jr. or Tucker Carlson in 2032.
Okay, but and making it more difficult for you, staying on this short-term level and telling the same about the AfD party.
There is a strange conviction that I hear expressed with particular confidence by political scientists, especially in Germany, that if you talk about the subjects of the populists, people will desert you and just go to the original. And I think that's profoundly wrong. That is an excuse to not grapple with and talk about the things that actually move and enrage people. And unless you're speaking to those things, nobody is ever going to listen to you. That doesn't mean that you say the same things about those subjects as the populists. But I think you need to speak to them. And the obvious one in Europe in particular is immigration. David Frum wrote an article a number of years ago in the American context, which I think applies here as well, which is, if liberals don't enforce borders, the fascists will. The thing that the population has asked for 30, 40 years at this point is we want control over our borders. And the moderate parties don't deliver on that.
What does it mean for Germany?
Well, I think one thing it means is just to distinguish between those two things. I don't think that means no immigration, right? And I think you can win a majority for a good amount of immigration, as you have, by the way, in every country that has effective control of its borders, in Canada and Australia and other places. You end up with significant levels of immigration, with much higher long-term public support, because people feel that they actually have control over this. And one thing that I just want to say morally is that I think there's this kind of strange starting point in a lot of this debate, that there's something moral about the current system. And I just want to say that sitting at a little bit of a distance from the United States or anywhere else, there's nothing moral about the current system. To say we're not doing anything for 99% of the refugees from Sudan, perhaps the refugees who are going to come out of Iran in the next weeks, the refugees or people who are just fleeing extreme poverty in Africa and in other countries, But if you manage to pay 10,000 euros to a criminal gang and you're willing to risk your lives and try and come across the Mediterranean and you survive that, then we help you. There's nothing moral about incentivizing that lottery. And nor is there anything moral to say, come here and we'll give you a livelihood that's probably better than where you come from if you come from a very poor country. But it's not anybody's idea of a particularly fun or meaningful life. We're not going to integrate you into our labor market. We put a lot of restrictions on how you can work. You'll always be under legal uncertainty about whether you can stay and whether you have to leave. None of this is actually a moral system. So let's dispense with the idea that by defending it, we're somehow on the side of morality.
Okay, I think that this is a moment when a lot of people would like to ask you questions. So I don't want to monopolize it. So we could come back to our conversation later. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate, because this is a unique opportunity to talk with Yascha Mounk, and this is always thrilling to hear you. So, Karolina, please.
I always have questions. So, I was listening with great interest, and thank you so much for this introduction. And I would like to ask you to develop a little bit more your argument about the 25%. Mm-hmm. So one might interpret what you have just said, that there is this 25% of professional managerial positions, people in those positions who actually who manage our countries, and that this is causing a large societal frustration of those 75%. The social ladder is down. No one can achieve the same status anymore. So this would mean the 25% are in a kind of offensive, and the rest are in a kind of defensive, where the 25% have to listen and to learn some kind of empathy in order to make the others feel better. But I would like to challenge that a bit. In the dynamics and the political dynamics of Germany, of Poland, of the US in the past 10 years, isn't it the other way around? Aren't the liberals actually in the defensive? And aren't the people who call themselves illiberals, right wings, or whom we call populists, aren't they actually in offensive? Isn't it that the cultural war actually looks completely different? That they are bringing the modernity. This is not liberal modernity, but they are still very modern. They have ideas how to change reality. We are saying, hola, yeah? Be careful, because you're going to spoil everything that we have been building after the Second World War, etc., etc., etc. So, isn't it that the dynamic is slightly different?
Well, I guess I disagree with this in two ways. The first is that I don't think it's nearly as simple as they started the culture war. I think a lot of what happened is that the institutions in the mainstream got so captured by the political sensibilities of a particular ideological faction and a particular social class that they stopped representing the rest of the population. And they also, there's two culprits here. They also are perfectly capable of going to war. But I think to just say they started, from these people and we're just, is I think not quite fair. And that's particularly true in the United States, and that's a lot of what this book is about. But I think it's true in Europe in various ways as well. And then the second thing is that I don't think that 25% is a hereditary caste. I think actually there is significant movement into and out of that 25%. But of course, what it does is that you transform people into members of it. So when I look at the university at which I teach, Johns Hopkins, we have, now costs nearly $100,000 a year to go to the university, all in. But if your parents earn less than about $180,000 a year, it's completely free, right? And so actually, for a lot of people, it is an incredibly good deal. Unless your parents are quite affluent, it's a free ride. And the university is very good at finding the kid in, the worst neighborhoods of Baltimore, or in the industrial Midwest, or in Alaska in a small town, who are talented, who are the best in the high school, and bring them into the university. And normally, when I speak to university presidents, I just had the quite interesting president or chancellor of Vanderbilt University, who's a German, Daniel Diermeier, on my podcast a couple of days ago. They will defend their institutions by saying, look at how we actually find these people who are not from this class, and we give them opportunity. And they're right about that. That is that's what I most love about my teaching job, right? But what they actually do is, in many ways, to take those people and to transform them into great members of a professional managerial class. I mean, this is worse in the States than in Germany, but they go back to the towns they're from twice a year, for Thanksgiving and for Christmas. And other than that, they go on to be doctors and investment bankers and whatever else in New York and LA and perhaps Chicago, right? And so the social function of that social escalator is to turn people into members of that 25%. And I think part of it is that I don't want to overstate the kind of how good the old thing was, which had many problems. There was a sense in a hereditary system, there's some sense of noblesse oblige, right? There's some sense of I'm lucky that I was born into this. Part of the problem of the new meritocratic class is that they say, I deserve it. We made my way up here. I worked really hard. I got all the good exam results. And that is true. They're all very smart and wonderful people. But that actually makes them feel they deserve it. And the other people who are below me, they also deserve that place. Now, to be very clear, I'm not against meritocracy. I know, I spend a lot of time in Italy. I know what it looks like when the person who gets the job is often the raccomandato, the person who's the cousin of somebody, rather than the person who did the exam results best. I am a defender of meritocracy. But to have the institution of meritocracy, where the best offices, the most important jobs go to the people who are most talented, we have to have less of a culture of the meritorious smugly ruling over the rest and thinking they deserve all the good things that come to them. That's the distinction that I'm trying to draw.
Okay, we have at least 3 more questions, but I don't know who was the first one, so maybe we'll start with your question.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your stimulating thoughts, and I fully agree that we finally should start thinking. And as obviously it cannot be an answer to say Trump is bad, AfD is bad, and therefore you need to vote for us. I mean, that's ridiculous. My question is how to go about it on a theoretical level and on a policy level. I mean, on a theoretical level, I think many of us have laughed about the idea of end of history a couple of years ago, but we behaved as if our system is the end of history, because we can't think beyond liberal democracy as it exists today. And myself, I find it extremely difficult to think beyond that. And the question is how to go about it. And I won't go into details, but one element I found in this book, Listening Society, I don't know if anybody knows it, where they try to identify the historical forces that led to the configuration we have with liberal democracy today, and don't look at the frozen situation we have, but at these forces and how have they developed further then to maybe come up with a new configuration. But I don't know if that's your answer. So what can we do on the theoretical level to think beyond the system as we have it, if this is the third crisis of liberalism? And on the policy level, I'm wondering who is writing the Heritage Foundation playbook of the left? And how can we go about the taboos we have on the center left and on the center right, which are quite ridiculous. I mean, on the center right, if you say we need bigger heritage tax, everybody will go up in arms. But it's obvious that a society cannot be just where you can only buy an apartment if your parents are rich. Yeah, it's ridiculous. And on the other side, maybe on the left sometimes we exaggerate, as some authors always show us, the idea of poverty and what does it really mean, and this very good old union sense of, well, we fight for the workers, but they also have to do their contribution has been somehow lost. So there are obvious taboos with this center of the road, middle of the road, common sense perspective. I would immediately call them out as this is nonsense, but we don't manage to move beyond it. So my question is how to go about it on the theory level and on the policy level.
Yascha.
Small question. Look, I think that is the million-dollar question, and I think if I want to convince you all of one thing, is that I just don't think that we have the answers yet. And that is what is most concerning to me about it. There's all kinds of people with kind of half-baked answers, and I can give you my own half-baked answers in a moment, and I will. But I just don't think that we actually have accomplished that. And I do think that, again, not the question of like, do we manage to keep the AfD out of the Bundesregierung in the next, Bundestagswahl, or do we make sure that a Republican doesn't win again in 2028? That's solvable without answering those more fundamental questions if you just like follow common sense and actually are willing to take seriously the concerns of your citizens and speak in a non-ideological manner and have some people who perhaps are less boring than Olaf Scholz. That's doable, right? But I think answering this deeper question, which is what it would take us to build a 70-80% majority around these ideas and actually marginalize the dangerous forces in our politics or force them to come back to the negotiating table by moderating, that'll take a much, much more fundamental transformation. Look, I mean, certainly in Europe, I think part of the answer is that we have resigned ourselves a little bit to be a museal continent. And I think that is a choice. It's not a choice we've made super deliberately, but it is a choice that is downstream from our actions. And I think that I participated in the launch of, it's great, France has a thing called Le Commissariat du Plan. So it's an actual office.
Clement Bon.
Who leads it, and it's an actual office that like makes the, it literally was founded by de Gaulle in order to make the 5-year plan. I mean, that's, Anyway, so they do an exercise called France 2050 where they project and think, and, it's interesting. As part of that, I was involved in that a little bit, and as part of that, they did a poll, and the poll shows that what French people think, and I'm sure the same is true in Germany, is like, how are things going to look in 2050 in France? And the answer is, the welfare state is going to be a little bit worse, and our social relations are going to be a little bit worse, and our democracy is going to be a little bit worse. But basically, things are going to look like today. And there's one thing I'm certain of, is that future does not exist. Either Europe reinvents itself and recognizes that you cannot be a plaything of geopolitical forces. We love to talk about how bad Donald Trump is, fair enough, but like, would you rather be the plaything of Moscow or Beijing? Right? Like, either we recognize that we need to be at the forefront of the key technologies of the future in order to be able to sustain employment here, and in order to be able to have the geopolitical weight that comes with economic success, or that imagined future of gradual decline does not exist. We're going to crash. And so this means trying to create a world-class European university which doesn't exist on the European continent. It means creating a startup infrastructure where people can get actual funding for projects. I have a friend who's a tech entrepreneur. He really wanted to found something in Europe. He says, it can take me 2 years to get 100,000 euros for 50% stake in Europe, or I can go to the United States and get $1 million for a 20% stake in 3 months. I want to be here, but like you're forcing me out, right? It means playing in the field of AI. I mean, the idea that people, our friends in Brussels have, that they're going to govern the future of AI when Europe, doesn't have AI, is absurd, right? The biggest German tech company sits not too far from here, or at least it has a big building not too far from here. It's called SAP, and it was founded 10 years before I was born, right? And the only reason, I hope there's no SAP people here, why it exists is that it has enterprise software that people bought 25 years ago, and it's really hard to change out of it.
No, don't underestimate SAP.
I know. I'm trying to provoke. But anyway, these are choices, right? Look at some of the most cutting-edge people in Silicon Valley. A lot of them are Europeans. They chose to go over there because that's where they have the opportunities. And that's something that strikes me in the imagination of my students. I teach mostly at Johns Hopkins, but I teach at Sciences Po some of the time as well. And the students are as good at Sciences Po as they are at Johns Hopkins. And their ambitions are much, much, much lower. And that is our fault. That should not be the case. And so I think, we've been talking about liberalism, but to talk about Europe, the German political elites have, for very understandable historical reasons, learned the lesson with which Konrad Adenauer, I guess, won a couple of elections, which is kind of experimental. We stumbled upon, or perhaps we had imposed upon us, a political economic model that sort of works after 1945. Let's hold on to it as best we can, because otherwise, who on earth knows where we're going to end? And that did well, for 60 or 70 years. It's pretty good. It's not a bad run. That model is over. And I'm struck by how little of a broader public debate there is about our urgent need to reinvent that European model. And that I think is an easier question to answer than the question about the reinvention of liberalism.
Okay, you are pushing us towards to a position of some kind of liberal reactionaries.
I don't think so. I think it's reactionary to be content with the fact that we don't play in technology, that we don't invest in our young people.
Progress.
Yeah, but that's the point, because in fact that was behind your question. And you somehow beautifully escaped from that, saying that we are going to
don't point it out.
we are staying on the short-term level, okay? But the point is that there is virtually you cannot gain this 60-70% of support if you don't present some kind of nicer idea of progress. I mean, the future, it's one of 4 pillars of liberalism. Please.
Challenge that you pose to liberalism by distinguishing between perfectionist liberalism and political liberalism on the other hand, on the one hand and on the other hand. Well, if I understood you correctly, you're saying that we pretend to be political liberals, but in fact we are perfectionist liberals. I like this a lot because, many so-called liberals today, they choose the other path by saying, well, not really perfectionism, but perhaps a little bit. And perhaps there is a slippery slope and we end up with post-liberalism, positions like Patrick Lenin, perhaps not as bad as this, but in a way. And so my question would be, what could we do in order to become genuine political liberalists?
Yeah, I think that has to do with a lot more respect for people who live very different lives. I think it also has to do with sort of returning to the slightly less ambitious vision of tolerance that actually I think stood at the beginning of the liberal tradition. You don't have to love people who are very different from you. You just have to tolerate them, right? And I think that there is a kind of demand for social inclusion on, a joy in the diversity, not just ethnic and sexual and so on, but of views, of lifestyles, of all of those things. If you say, I don't like any of this, but I'm okay with it. They get to, that today is enough. If you say that in a workplace, if you say that certainly in a university, etc. It's not my position, by the way. I live in New York City for a reason. I like places that are messy and complicated and diverse. I hate this German word, but but not everybody is, and that's fine, right? There's gonna be the person in the village who says, I don't know, this country's changing a lot, there's all kinds of weird things, and I don't like any of it. But you know what? We live in a liberal society, let them do what they want. And that's enough of a win, right? The original purpose of liberalism was that people said, if I'm a Catholic and you're a Protestant, I'm gonna kill you. And it was to say, let's just say you get to be Protestant, I get to be a Catholic, and I might hate you and you might hate me, but we can coexist as members of the same polity, and I can let you go to pray as you want, and you can let me go to pray as I want. That is a huge historical achievement. I think, being a little bit less ambitious in that sense would already do a lot to make people feel more included.
Okay, Ralph?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It depends on exactly what the Antidiskriminierungsstelle does in practice, but certainly, I certainly think that corporations shouldn't be allowed to discriminate.
So I was also quite intrigued by this differentiation between political and perfectionist liberalism. Not so sure if it is the adequate term. You also could call it kind of liberal hypocrisy. Yeah, pretending that we are the advocates of pluralism and tolerance, and everybody should be entitled to strive for happiness in its own fashion and in its own way, but de facto there was a tendency to make liberal lifestyles and the way we talk, our worldview, dominant, and to make it a kind of obligatory standard for all. So it was a kind of a hegemonial cultural liberalism, which I think contributed to that kind of anger and anti-liberal backlash we are then observing. And I would like to invite you to deepen a little bit on this. What are the sources of this brewing anger and fury we are observing in a lot of Western democracies? Yeah, I think it is just it is corresponding with the dramatic decline in trust on democratic institutions and especially on political parties. And you wrote a piece on that lately. I think we still are not at the bottom of this process, the implosion of the old democratic center.
Mm-hmm.
And so this creates a vacuum in which then the populists are aggressively then entering. So what are the sources of that? Is it more the socio-economic factors, like social and economic polarization between winners and losers of globalization and digital then revolution? Is it more about cultural aspects? The loss of security, not in the narrow terms of social security, no, it's more kind of mental security and in trust of the future. So this kind of pessimism, which now is dominating the public mindset, I think especially in Europe, maybe it's a little bit different still in the US, and it's totally different in Asia, in most of the emerging economies. What are the root cause? And what is the answer? Is it democracies have to deliver? Yeah, they have to deal seriously with the challenges people are then facing. Or what is it?
Great question. I mean, a couple of words. One is just, I think I just hit upon a slightly different formulation of I guess, the point about perfectionist liberalism and so on, which is that, we know from history that empires and countries are particularly vulnerable when they're overextended, right? When they, and I think in a sense, one of the problems with liberalism is that in going de facto from a political liberalism to a philosophical liberalism, it sort of overextended itself. And so at its moment, because you said this word hegemony, at the moment of its maximum hegemony, or the moment of its maximum influence, in the year 2000, when we felt like this is what the future is, unbeknownst to us, it was in fact particularly vulnerable, precisely because it was overextended in that kind of way. It asked too much of people, and that's where some of that response came to. The second point I want to make is that I think we need to forget the period from 1950 to 1973. I think it has set our imagination for what a mature democracy looks like. And somebody said earlier, we laugh about the end of history, but we all kind of were influenced by it. Perhaps it was you. In political science, when I was in graduate school, said, "Oh, Fukuyama is so wrong, ha ha ha." I think actually it's a very insightful article and book. And then people still believed in basic forms of modernization theory, which said that all good things go together and its countries become more affluent, more educated, will become more democratic, more tolerant, the postmodernist values, and all of those things, right? All of this was deeply part of the same set of assumptions about ideas, often formulated in rather less subtle ways than Fukuyama would. And it's all based, I think, on an over-interpretation of the 1950s and 1960s. For a whole complicated host of reasons, there was an unusual period of stability in our democracies because people were shocked from World War II, because there was very rapid economic growth, because the Soviet Union was around the corner and having nukes, a number of reasons, right? And we think that's what a normal democracy looks like, and we're kind of measuring ourselves against the standards of the stability of those years. And it's just, that is an extraordinary moment of economic growth plus other things that just isn't normally going to happen. Compare the life of an average European in 1930 to 1970, right? Like the invention of penicillin, the introduction of a car, the popularization of fridges, the television, it's just a completely different world. And we're not going to go through a period like that unless AI ends up being very transformative and influential, and that will also come with deep problems. That's a separate topic I'm happy to talk about. And so I think we need to stop thinking that that is the normal. In some senses, when you look at the broader run history of democracy, chaos and demagogues and unhappiness and fear of the future is kind of normal, right? So it's not as weird as it seems. That may just be what it's like forever, right? The second point I'll make is that I think there are economic roots which are important, and I've just emphasized one. They don't fully fit the evidence. So when I teach this, I say, there's 3 tests that you should apply to any potential explanation of the rise of populism: temporal, geographic, and phenomenological. Right? Like a change, so a constant can't explain a change, right? Only a change can explain a change. So you have to have seen something new happen to explain this rapid rise of populists. Geographically, some explanations that seem to work really well in the United States or in West Germany don't work so well in East Germany or in Poland or in India or in Turkey, right? I mean, phenomenological. There needs to be some kind of fit between the thing we're talking about and what's happening. So economic explanations don't do very well on that, because the last 25 years, certainly outside of Western Europe, haven't been uniquely economically bad, because countries like Poland are vastly more affluent today than they were 35 years ago. Because you would expect, if it's really all about the economy, that it's the left-wing populists who are winning, but it's mostly the right-wing populists who are winning, the kind of phenomenological test. So something about that doesn't quite seem to fit. I think social media does fit that bill. I mean, that is something that was introduced in the last 25 years everywhere. And you see how much use the populists make of that and how that medium seems to play to their strengths. So I think that is one explanation that we have to take seriously. I think some of those cultural transformations and some of that liberal overextension has been true in various ways in most of the countries we're talking about as well.
Okay, we have at least 3 more questions. That was the first one. Yeah, please.
I found very interesting when you compared the students at Johns Hopkins with the ones at Sciences Po. And I also found remarkable that you mentioned that entrepreneurs shy away from bureaucracy in Europe and maybe especially in Germany, and rather go to the Silicon Valley. And in that context, I would like to ask you, when you were talking about the ideas of the past, which were 25 years ago, the liberal ideas, isn't European integration also something which might have worked quite well 25 years ago, when changes weren't that quick, when there was no AI, when there was no right-wing governments like in, or left-wings like in Slovenia and Hungary, which are now blocking every decision in Europe. At the same time, you were proposing, if I understood you correctly, a European university on a better level than the ones which are existing now. But I radically want to ask, isn't disintegration of the European community at the moment maybe the right way of going forward? Apart from the economic advantages which we in Germany might have, but if you see that Indonesia, I think, was able to block this terrible sexist AI things of Elon Musk, and probably in Europe it will take a year before we make a decision on that point. So how do you see that in the future? Is the integration the right way in a very fast changing environment?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really good question. I'm going to pick on one little thing you said because I think it's illustrative about what's happened to the idea of Europe. I said we have to have a world-class university in Europe, in continental Europe. And you understood it to mean a EU-run university. And that tells us something about what's happened on the European continent. I think I'm the last generation of people for whom Europe was a moving ideal. And it comes because of my family history, it becomes from other things. I think there's very few people who are 20 years younger than me who have that kind of sentimental relationship to the idea of Europe. And most of the reason for that is that when you say Europe today, what you mean is Brussels. And what you mean is an evidently pretty dysfunctional set of bureaucratic institutions. Now, they may be better than the alternative, right? I certainly don't think that Brexit has gone very well. But the European ideal has become, the European Commission and the European Parliament doesn't even have real powers, and all of that. And that actually has just sounded the death knell of the European ideal for young people, I think. Which doesn't mean that they don't love to go and study in other countries and speak a bunch of languages. In many ways, they're more European than any generation before them. But I think they've soured on the idea of Europe because it has just come to be taken up by this quite sad bureaucratic reality. And that's something where I just want to pose the problem, and I know even less about what to do about it. I think Europe as a continent can make choices to play in history, but whether the EU will allow it to do that, and how to grapple with that fact without throwing our lots in with the nationalist anti-Europeans who I don't think are going to solve any problems at all, is a really, really hard puzzle. But I think if we allow for another 25 years, the idea of Europe and even the word of Europe to just be coterminous with the European Commission, we're going to have an even worse anti-European nationalist revolution on our hands.
Okay, another question.
Yeah. I was thinking about, I mean, we were discussing, and you brought up many of the points about the shortcomings of liberalism, liberal democracy. And what I was wondering about is, I mean, as far as I see it, the main problem of liberalism is that there is no idea for future. But on the other hand, all those congruent populists from left and right, they don't have an idea for future either. And the question then basically is, why can't we as liberals invent ideas for future, or at least popularize them? Because I mean, there are ideas basically, and I wonder if this isn't connected to the change of public through basically social media and other devices, because this is something liberal democracy didn't yet adapt to. I mean, if you look at political debates, if you have a talk show in the evening, you find the scandalized short clips taken out, which are going, like, I mean, it happens within minutes, so people, like politicians, try to avoid any statement which might be controversial, which, of course, touches the heart of democracy, public debate. And my question is, how can we, do you have an idea how to overcome this paradoxon that through freedom of speech in social media and the lack of control or somehow ideas how to deal with it, how we can return to a public debate and thus discuss a broader future?
Yeah, so a few points about this. The first is that I think we overstate the extent to which populism is nostalgic and wants to go back to the past. It's an obvious point, make America great again, all the arguments are there and they're obvious. And that may be how Donald Trump won the primaries in 2016, and perhaps it's how he won, the state of Michigan in 2016. It's not how he won most of the people who made him president the second time round. From 2016 to 2024, Trump's share of the vote among the white American population declined, and his share among black voters, Asian American voters, and Latino voters in particular increased very rapidly. And there's a lot of young people who voted for Trump in 2024. And the reason for that, I think, is that in many ways they saw him as aspirational. Part of that was his alliance with Elon Musk and Occupy Mars, and we're going to go do these. None of this happens, right? But that was part of the appeal. Part of it was that when Democrats talk about social issues, they say, we'll raise the minimum wage. Trump says, if you run a small, I want you to be able to run a small business, and I want you to be able to make good money and pay less tax on that, and you're going to be rich. That may not be realistic, but that's aspirational, right? The Democrats are saying, look, if you work a minimum wage, you're still going to earn minimum wage in 3 years, but minimum wage is going to be a little bit higher, right? Trump is saying, actually, you're going to transform your life, and you're going to be an entrepreneur, and you're going to do great, right? Which of these two is more aspirational? It's a complicated question, right? So I think we need to recognize that actually we often don't sound very aspirational either. Say we're going to raise the minimum wage by $2 an hour. Maybe a good policy, I'm not against it, but that doesn't sound aspirational, right? The point about the future is a very important one. But again, how much of a promise of a future are we actually offering? And to what extent are there certain holy cows that make it so hard for us to do that? We talked briefly about apartments and the fact that, only if you stand to inherit an apartment, are going to have a nice apartment. Well, one way you can deal with that is with inheritance tax, and perhaps that's part of it. But another way we deal with that is to build a lot more apartments, which a lot of countries around the world are managing to do. And Germany is pretty bad at it, and the United States is disastrous at it, right? So why don't we actually, if where people want to be is in places like Berlin and so on, why aren't we able to build the number of apartments that then allow people to actually move to those centers of economic opportunity and be in the places they want and have a comfortable living space? When it comes to migration, I think it's very concerning, but we've basically told people that they have a choice. Either you like the rule of law and you accept that we basically have no control over our borders, or you want to have control of our borders, and the way to accomplish that is to throw overboard the rule of law. People are going to make the wrong choice on that one. And there's nothing about the principles of liberalism, which means that you can't have the rule of law and also effective control of your borders. There's a set of choices that we've made. So I think the problem is not that there can't be a vision for the future, but the vision of the future has to be like, the vision for the future doesn't have to be super inventive. It's just like your life's going to be good and perhaps going to be better than today, and you're going to be able to do stuff. Right? Like, that's pretty simple, but that's certainly what is lacking in an extreme way in Germany right now, and it's lacking in France in an extreme way right now, and it's lacking in Britain in an extreme way right now. And that, I think, is a big part of the reason, to get back to your earlier question, Ralph, for why so many people are going to the populists. Because they might not believe the promises of the populists, but at least the populists are making promises. What promises are we actually making? And like, again, I don't think that means we have to like invent some like new vision of the future that's totally different. It just means that we actually have to have the, I mean, perhaps this is kind of the centrist radicalism or whatever, the radical center, right? Like show that we're willing to rethink our institutions where they don't work for pretty straightforward, pragmatic, widely shared, sensible ends.
There was one more point. In many countries where populists got into power, they simply, it was visible how you could observe the elite change process. That was simply incredible. That was like a rocket for so many. Well, a lot of them were educated, by the way, but like J.D. Vance, yeah. Very well educated, but without populism, he wouldn't be where he is now. Yeah? So that's one thing. But another one is that it is for the sake of equality. That's the word that was not mentioned today. I mean, that's for the sake of equality. Why not me? This is behind a lot of those persons that would like to join the populist movements all over the world, because it helps you to get a shortcut in your career. I mean, it's especially it was visible among lawyers. Lawyers were making legal battles because you know the area of fruits to be shared diminished. So you should be quick, and therefore one cannot say that Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance, they are not very well educated, yeah. But they are using this shortcut. Marie-Louise.
Yeah, I think the topic is so broad, and then looking at different countries makes it even more difficult. I was missing one word which is hard to grab, but I think we had a political person who was representing it by herself, and that was Angela Merkel with being modest. And I think modesty is something which does not fit into times where social media are so important. We were talking to a young colleague of our fraction last night, and he said, we have such a big possibility of hiring people in our office to develop policies, to work politically within Parliament. And what do? They spend that money on social media, which is performance and nothing underneath. So this, I think, is a big problem. Angela Merkel, even if we now look back at her time, there was so much which she did not do and should have started. And just take the book of Bloger and her partner, where she did not deliver. But she was very modest, and that was coming from deep within. And then you have symbols in times of social media, and Mr. Lindner going to Sylt and having this symbol waiting here. In the United States, probably it would have been totally okay. In Germany, it was something where my feeling was, don't do that. It's not good for liberal people, not for the Liberal Party. And then, Merz flying there, which was courses, he did not come with his personal jet, but still, you should know those signs in Germany, and modesty is something I think is very, very important. And number second is, I think, overstretching, you called it, overstretching of, and that's why I was provoking with those anti-discrimination politics, because you must understand, it is always forcing people to define themselves. Anti-discrimination politics always means, if you want to apply there, you have to define whether you have been a quarter Jew, half a Jew, three-quarter of a Jew, whether you have been discriminated on that. When we made this law, we pushed in anti-discrimination of age. It's so broad. And we, and this green people, did not understand that with that we pushed the gap within our society deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think at the moment, the chance, the Green Party, you can see that very well, they really lost hold 4 years ago with two ministers who, I think, represented elite showing up, an elite way of showing up, not understanding people anymore. Heating is something which has been touching every household. And then making plans on a meta level and not being really down there. And one person which still does dare to talk is Mr. Söder. Why? He's not so timid when he talks. I mean, he's very opportunistic. It's terrible for us, but he's not timid. So I think there's so much fine-tuning we have to do, and the Green Party, to a certain extent, I think, made many faults in those meta levels, and unfortunately, the Social Democrats adapted it, which makes it even worse, because this is not the territory for Liberal Democrats, who have to keep relation to other parts of our society.
Yeah.
We have two more questions, so
okay.
Please briefly.
Well, this is a fantastic point. Just one thing very briefly, Ben. I think modesty is right. I think that actually in Merkel's case, the modesty was a particular modality of something that still works today. And I think still would work, 7 years later, which is authenticity. Authenticity. Authentizität. Merkel was who she was. And she wasn't interested in pretending to be anything else. By the way, Trump is also who he is, and he's not interested in very, very different figures, but that both works. The problem is that most of us are the word that Ralph said earlier, which is hypocrites. Or perhaps somebody else said it, right? Where you're pretending to be one thing, but you're actually not. And that is the thing that doesn't work. If you say, I'm a man of this, by the way, Kamala Harris,
That's too easy.
Her mother is a research PhD scientist. Her father is a professor at Stanford University. She grew up mostly in Canada, as well as in Berkeley. And which is fine. What slogan does she choose? I'm a woman of the people. That lack of self-knowledge, that hypocrisy, that is what, you're a double child of professors and you go around saying, ich bin ein einfacher Mann. Yeah, that doesn't work because it completely misses that element of you know who you are. And So I think, so in that sense, I know it sounds very paradoxical. I think Merkel's political strength and Trump's political strength, in that particular sense, they have nothing else in common, is related. They're themselves and they're unashamed to be themselves. They're not pretending to be anything else.
Okay, two last questions, so maybe we'll take both.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I was going to push back a little bit on what you said about story of the future, if you like. You said that basically the promise of the future should be that of a good life and a good job, and that it didn't really have to be all that pompous and complicated. I wonder, going back to the beginning of your remarks, if we're really in a situation where you need something of a rather fundamental socio-economic reinvention, where really you need to, fundamentally think about stuff, that is very difficult for people, and usually, at least if you look at history, it works a lot better if you have a story to tell, where you're going and what it all means. And if you look at the other side, as you will, the populists even have a story to tell, and they have a story to tell which is quite powerful. This is all dysfunctional, let's just deal with it. They're not telling a positive story, but they are telling a story. Let's just burn it all down, and then we'll see, what happens then. The only other story that I can make out is sort of this hyper-modern story of Silicon Valley elite that are basically saying, well, it's all teleological in the sense that if there's problems, just more technology, and then more technology, and at some point technology will kind of, just more technology, which I think works in a way for a certain clientele, but is obviously very elitist. I was wondering, at least I've got that feeling that it'd be very, very good to have a story to tell that's a bit more positive than everything's falling down, but you're going to be fine. Especially if you can't make the trains run on time, who's going to believe you?
Okay,
well,
I will. Let's pick up the last question from you,
Yes.
very briefly, please, because we are out of time.
It's going in the same direction. The idea is, if you look at cinema, etc., it's all dystopia. The world is falling apart, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in the end. The question is, because you mentioned it a couple of times, if we redistribute more money through some taxes, people will get more houses. I'm telling you, I don't get it, because it's half of the Robin Hood. I take the money, and I put it into the government, and how are the poor getting more? Because the education system is not working. If you're telling me I'm getting streets, I look around, I don't get streets. I'm losing money in the government, it's just zipping away. And the question is, how do we get a new social kind of contract? Because this one doesn't seem to work, because it's built on growth.
Okay.
And this growth is not anymore, because we are getting old in Europe, and we are losing. And as you told yourself, we need growth in the end, economical growth, because we are getting fat. We got fat, and we just are thinking about how can we redistribute it, how can we organize it more, and therefore we are losing people to other continents.
Yeah, please, yes.
So 2 points. The first is, you kind of said at the end, I think that any vision of degrowth is completely politically toxic, and the reality of degrowth is completely politically toxic.
And also ecologically, it's irrational. It's counterproductive.
I agree with that as well. But if you have economic stagnation for long periods of time, that's the biggest layup, the biggest present you can give to the extremes in our politics, and they're the ones who are going to go for. So I think Europe needs to have the will to reinvent itself and to reform itself in such a way that it can actually keep and add on to its affluence over the coming decades. Otherwise, you're going to have a disaster on every proportion. But that speaks to the other point. Look, I'm very open to having great visions. I don't personally have one to offer. I wish I did. I'm very open to ideas. But I think the problem is that at the moment, people don't believe that they can make the trains run on time. And people don't believe that, they doubt some of the rationale they're going to have pensions, and they feel like, I mean, I've lived for the last 9 months in New York without gas because it turns out that I was paying for my neighbor's gas bill, my neighbor was paying for my gas bill, which neither of us particularly cared about. But the moment the city realized that, they switched off the gas. And it took them 9 months to reattach it. And then our new mayor came in and said, we're going to run grocery stores. It's like, really, you're going to run a supermarket if you can't give me gas, right? So right. So the point is like, by all means, if you have a great vision and if you have a politician who can credibly sell it, I'm all game. But the precondition for anybody giving a hearing to that is that we actually can give young people real opportunities, have economic growth, make you feel like it's not preordained that the world is going to be worse in 20 years, control our borders and make sure that you have gas in your home.
Okay, thank you, Yascha. It was a pleasure to hear you. I think that maybe it may sound like a provocation. I think that you pushed. I wanted to ask you a question about your favorite liberal author for today, and you have, in many ways, you have answered. It's Schumpeter. You are pushing us. You are pushing us towards a creative destruction, this way or another. So, thank you very much for this meeting, Yascha.